Okay, so there is a tradition in governments with parliamentary systems where for 15 minutes every day, the Prime Minister takes questions from all members of the government body, right? You know, so all members of Parliament, right? Now, we don't have 15 minutes to do this, and usually the opposition parties just use this as a chance to grandstand and try to catch the Prime Minister in, you know, in a lie or a faulty response or something like that. But what I would like to do at the beginning of every class is give you a chance to ask me whatever questions you have about the material or about the homework or about anything you have related to the class, right? So does anybody have any questions about anything? You know, feel free to take a minute to think about this, right? Because I know I've kind of just sprung this on you. You may not have a question at the moment. But yeah, think about whether there's anything that is bothering you or confusing you about the class that I might be able to clear up for you now.
So the assignment due tonight, it has to be in like paragraph form, right?
Yeah, it should be submitted in essay form, yes.
Okay, so it has to be like MLA format,
Mm-hmm.
with an introduction and conclusion.
Yeah, does everybody know how to do MLA format?
I didn't do that, so could I like unsubmit it and
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, if you already submitted something and you're not happy with it, you want to redo it, that's okay. I'm only going to read your most recent submission, right? So if there are 2 submissions, I'm only going to read and grade the one that came in last, right?
So you want like an introduction, 3 bodies, and a conclusion?
Not necessarily. It doesn't have to be quite that formal, right? So I think what you're describing is not so much MLA format as 5-paragraph form.
Mm-hmm.
And 5-paragraph form isn't actually what we're going to be doing in this class.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be organizing papers along different principles. But right now, I wouldn't worry too much about like a formal introduction or conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Just like...
Yeah, but I want everything done out in paragraph form, yeah.
Okay.
So one thing to note about paragraphing, right? It's best to think of it as a kind of service to your reader to make what you've written less confusing, right? Because if I am just looking at a great big block of texts with no differentiation and no indentation, right? I don't know where one of your ideas starts and where another begins. So every time you move on to a new idea, start a new paragraph. In general, a good paragraph should be about half a page long, double-spaced. And yeah, that's just kind of a general rule of thumb, right? Some are going to be a little longer, some are going to be a little bit shorter, right? But if you notice a paragraph that's maybe only a couple of sentences long, you might want to combine it with another paragraph because you're probably not fully developing that idea there. And if you notice one that's more than, say, 2/3 of a page long, then you probably want to find places to cut it, right? It's like, okay, I'm actually talking about something else here. I can split this into 2 paragraphs, right? Other questions?
Does that assignment have to be 500 words deep?
Yeah, unless I say otherwise, just assume 500 words generally. So it's going to be like roughly a little over a page and a half, right? Is double spaced is going to be the standard here. And just to put an upper limit on things as well, right? Just so that everybody knows that writing more isn't necessarily better. If what you give me is longer than 750 words, then you're probably trying to do too much. So 500 words or thereabouts is the sweet spot, right? 750 or more that's getting into the realms of excess here, right? So we want to try to keep everything specific and focused, right? I think that that's a good principle that we want to work with for the rest of the course, right? Always be as specific as possible. Even when you're asking me questions, right? Because a more specific question is going to get a more specific answer. A vague question is likely going to get a vague or fuzzy answer. Yeah, Gary, you got a question.
Oh, no, sir, it wasn't important.
Oh, okay, well, but it was a question?
Yes, sir, it wasn't anything.
Okay, well, if you feel comfortable asking me at the end of class, whatever it is.
Well, it was about, 700 words.
Uh-huh.
You were implying that, it doesn't have to be that great amount of words, but it has to be 500.
It does have to be at least 500, yeah. See, that actually is an important question. Because, you're making sure what the parameters are for the assignment, right?
Yes, sir.
So, yeah, that is absolutely, questions about form are just as important as questions about content, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, anything else?
And all your assignments will be due at 11:59 that night, right?
Always, yep.
Including the cap, right?
Yep. Yep, that is always going to be the case.
Cool.
Okay, so anything else, or are we ready to move on? Okay, I want to start then by giving you another quotation to close read. So this is taken from a little book written at a roughly 8th grade level that a filmmaker turned into a trilogy of 3 films full of CGI monsters massing in armies. And what I want you to try to do with this is the same kind of stuff generally that we've been doing with the other quotes, right? I want you to first figure out the literal meaning of this, right? What's going on the literal level. And then look for patterns of repetition and patterns of contrast, right? Look for words and concepts that repeat. Look for things that seem to be in opposition to each other, right? Even if those things are implied rather than clearly stated. Everybody's got this? I can get rid of it? Okay. don't think there's any difficult vocabulary in this, but as usual, if there are any words you don't know, right, just ask me. So let's just pause here for a second, and I just want to ask if everybody feels like they have a grasp on what is literally going on here in the quote. Okay, yeah. So what literally happens here?
Sounds like two people got together. And
Okay.
They were quarreling before, maybe. But,
Okay. What gives you a sense of quarreling in this?
well, he asked the question, what do you mean? And
Uh-huh.
it was sort of implicit about, good morning.
Yeah. So there is questioning going on here, right? What's being questioned?
The phrase, what he meant by good morning.
Yeah. So Bilbo says good morning to Gandalf, and Gandalf asks him, what do you mean by good morning? And then goes on to do what?
Give a whole bunch of interpretations on what it could mean.
Yeah, he points out all the different things that Bilbo might conceivably mean by good morning, right?
So it could Gandalf like being in a bad mood that morning, and like having being told good morning was like
Well,
normal.
do we have enough information here to decide that?
I mean, no, but his questioning just makes it seem like, he didn't want to hear it.
Okay, well the questioning the questioning might come off as a little cranky, right? But there is something, there is something else we might want to pay attention to here, right? Good morning, said Bilbo, and he meant it. And then what word does Gandalf repeat?
Good.
Well, right, good morning, right, he repeats that. But what word that is in this first sentence also gets repeated?
Me.
Mean, right? So pay close attention to that, right? That's a place to focus, right? This notion of meaning. Bilbo meant it. What do you mean? Take a few more minutes and try to pick that apart. And in particular, think about what the argument they're having is concerned with, right? What is the subject that it's about? you've got some stuff to share, just go ahead and speak up. So what's their argument about? What are they arguing over?
Well, evening, actually good morning, or something the opposite of that.
Yeah, so specifically, right, what they're arguing about is the meaning of good morning. So what more general point is being argued here? Then what can we broaden out to? If we're arguing about meaning here, and what a particular phrase means, what generally are we arguing about? What is the primary means we have at our disposal for expressing meaning? Yeah, it's about language, right?
In the way you say it, or tone.
Yeah, they're having an argument about language. And do we see here different attitudes towards language expressed by both characters?
What was the question?
Are we seeing both of these characters expressing different attitudes towards language? Okay, how so? What's Bilbo's attitude towards language?
Cheerful? I'm sorry.
You don't need to analyze the word, it's just a word. Good morning.
Yeah, that the meaning should be clear, right? That there's a clear relationship between the word and what I mean, and when I say it, you ought to understand it, right? And what is Gandalf pointing out to Bilbo?
It's like something just for like 2 words.
Yeah, that what you are saying to me can mean any number of other things depending on context, right? So, while Bilbo meant it when he said good morning, he didn't make it clear exactly what it was he meant, which is what the wizard is pointing out. So what we have here is an argument between two different theories of language, right? Bilbo, and here's, where we see, a pattern of contrast here, right? Bilbo is arguing for what linguists call the transparent theory of language. Right? According to this particular theory, there is a clear relationship between words and the things they describe. Right? Thus, when you speak, it should be obvious what you mean, even absent any context, because words are connected to things. What Gandalf is arguing is the position adopted by those who advocate for what they call the constitutive theory of language, which is the actual position of most professional linguists and philosophers. So these people would argue that language is inherently ambiguous and is context dependent. Right? Nothing that we say means anything outside of a particular context. So without context, Gandalf can't know what Bilbo means by good morning. At the same time, language also constructs the world we live in. Right? Our lived reality is shaped by the words that we use. And by the kinds of subtle gradations between meanings of different words. Right? We use words to create the context in which they mean something. So, to carry this notion a little bit further, right? What's a synonym?
That means the same.
Yeah. A word that means roughly the same thing as another word, right? There really isn't any such thing as a true synonym, because if two words in like language actually tends to be pretty efficient, and if we don't need a word, it tends to fall out of the language, right? So synonyms are usually only kind of rough equivalents to each other. Now, some of these equivalencies are basically situational. So if I give you the words shit, defecate, and bowel movement, these all mean the same thing, right? But they don't, exactly. We don't use them in the same contexts, right? Right. Shit can also be something that you say, like, when you wake up and you're stumbling around in the dark and you stub your toe on the footstool or the leg of the bed, right? It's something, it's a word that is often regarded as vulgar. Right? It's impolite. What about defecate? In what contexts does that word tend to appear? What's that?
I was just looking at the subject. Maybe you taught us a Latin word.
Yeah. It's a Latin style word. It's a word that comes to us from Latin. And what do we tend to use these Latinate words for?
I say, like formal stuff.
Yeah, like formal, scientific, technical language, right? So this is more of a clinical kind of term, right? Used in a more kind of formal scientific context. And bowel movement is a polite euphemism that, pardon?
I think doctors use it more than
That bowel movement?
Yeah, like I hear doctors say it more than
Yeah.
like the people.
Well, 'cause it's a way to refer to the thing without actually mentioning the thing itself, right? Just the motion of the part of your body that it goes through. So, yeah, bowel movement is a polite euphemism that refers to the same thing as these other two, right? So why do we have all three of these words for the same thing? Right? Well, because we don't use them in the same contexts. And the context in which we tend to use these words is shaped by history. All three of these words have different roots. So Gary already noted for us that defecate sounds like a Latin word, and it is. It comes from Latin. Shit comes from Anglo-Saxon, right? The ancestor language of modern English, which is actually a very different language from the English we speak today, right? If you look at a page of Anglo-Saxon, right, it's no longer intelligible to a modern English speaker. It looks and sounds more like German. And bowel movement comes from French. So how do we end up with these three different terms for the same thing in the same language used in these particular contexts? How does history make this happen?
Immigration, like people coming over and introducing authority.
Yeah, immigration in some cases and invasion in others, right? So the case of French here, right? I'm not sure how much any of you know about British history. I'm going to assume not very much because that generally seems to be the case with my Comp 2 classes. If you do know about this already, then good on you. So in 1066, England is invaded by warriors from France called the Normans. And the Normans defeat the English, and they become the new upper class, right? They become the new aristocracy. They're in charge of everything. So what this means for the English language is that a lot of our words that have to do with elite culture of any kind, so words that have to do with fashion, words that have to do with cooking, law, military tactics and ranks, right? General, marshal, lieutenant, captain, right? These are all words that come from French. And even, as we said, polite euphemisms tend to come from French. So the English, whom they defeated, are relegated to a kind of underclass, right? So what this means is that a lot of the words that the English used, the Anglo-Saxons used, become regarded as kind of vulgar peasant words, right? Especially words that refer to body functions. There's nothing inherently wrong or evil about the word shit, right? I'm not going to be struck by lightning if I say it, right? I'm not going to lose my job. You know, I could tap dance up here for an hour or for, you know, however long the class lasts and just say shit, shit, shitty, shit, 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 right? Because I'm protected by tenure and it's hard to fire me. Although I would be an extremely irresponsible educator if that was all I did. And I would deserve to be fired. But yeah, my point is, right, is that the reason we regard this word as vulgar is an accident of history. And nothing to do with anything inherent in the word itself. Now, Latin gets into English. Latin and Greek get into English because Latin was that international language of scholarship and of educated people, right? Because it was the language of the Catholic Church when that was a kind of pan-European organization that included pretty much the only people who could read. So, Latin enters our kind of formal, technical, scientific vocabulary that way, right? So let's look at words that we actually tend to regard as synonyms, right? More words that we tend to regard as synonyms. And we'll look at the ways in which they actually involve gradations of meaning as well that are less determined by history and more by usage. So if I take the words prejudice, discrimination, racism and put them up here, right? We tend to use these words more or less interchangeably, right? To what extent do they actually mean the same thing, though? They're referring to similar things, right? But there are subtle differences between the actual meanings of this, or particularly the way sociologists and psychologists use the terms, right? So does anybody know what we mean specifically when we talk about prejudice? What is prejudice?
Now that you say that, I don't know it.
Yeah, because we're really not used to thinking of it that way, right?
It's probably something you might not like or
Yeah, well, if you have a prejudice, right, it's a personal feeling of dislike, right? So prejudice is, yeah, a personal feeling that you have against a particular group or a particular class of people, right? So if I were to say, I just don't like people with red hair, right? Then I would have a prejudice against people with red hair. So then what's discrimination?
Is it more like how it was like segregation, like known, just like shown all the time?
Would it be like you choosing this person because of their race over another person of a different race?
Yeah, discrimination refers to an action that you take based on prejudice, right? And I think, Elizabeth, what you were talking about is closer to what the technical meaning of racism is, right? Where racism refers to a legal system that's set up to advantage one group at the expense of others, right?
So basically, you can't have discrimination without having prejudice.
I guess you theoretically could, right? You know, somebody could not be personally prejudiced against particular groups, but could discriminate against them because they're operating within a racist legal system, right? So while you may not have any personal animus against people of a particular group, right? If the laws of your society mean that in your job you have to discriminate against particular people, like say, you have two applicants for a job of different races. Your boss tells you, well, you have to hire that person, or the law tells you you have to hire that person. Then you are discriminating, but you're not doing so on the basis of personal prejudice necessarily. It's also possible to be, at least theoretically, to be prejudiced against particular people or groups without actively discriminating against them.
So like you're hating from afar.
Pardon?
So like you're like hating from afar.
Yeah. It's certainly possible to harbor those feelings within yourself without ever acting upon them. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that both of these terms refer to personal feeling and action, right? Whereas the third refers to a society-wide system, right? The way a society is organized based on law, right? So while we tend to use, again, the larger point here, right, is that while we tend to use the words interchangeably in casual conversation, they're all retained in the language because they don't really mean the same thing, right? Okay, does anybody have any questions so far? This is probably not the way we're used to thinking about language, right?
So would it be like kind of like paraphrasing, like in the book, it's like taking just one sentence and writing it 3 different types of ways using them?
Yeah, and usually what paraphrasing reveals to us, the reason the book wants us to do that, is because the act of trying to find a synonym makes us think harder about what the words we're trying to replace really mean, right? So if we take, say, this passage, and we try to find a synonym for, say, good, right? are we going to find a word that expresses the meaning of good quite as clearly as what's already in the sentence? No, right? But thinking about it will help us determine what exactly is meant by good, right? So actually, let's do a little bit of practice with that. Let's go to that exercise in the textbook on page 47. And try to break down some of these phrases through paraphrase, right? So let's start with this first one. Right, the 6 most dangerous words in the English language. I am entitled to my opinion. So the first thing to do is identify what the key meaning-bearing words are in the sentence, right? And then try to replace them with words that mean nearly the same thing. So what are the key words here?
Entitled and opinion.
Okay, entitled, opinion, and my and I are also important meaning-bearing words here, right? Okay, so take a minute and try to come up with as many synonyms for these words. We're trying to retain the original sentence structure as closely as possible as you can, and see what you come up with. And just go ahead and speak up when you feel like you've got something to share.
Does that have to be like one word synonyms?
What's that?
Does it have to be like one word synonyms?
If you can't think of a one-word synonym, then you can try to use a phrase or...
Like for entitled, have a right to.
Okay. Okay, so...
And then opinion, how one feels.
Okay, good.
I have deserve.
Okay, I deserve.
For opinion, I say voice.
Okay.
For opinion, I have their thoughts.
Okay. What else you got? See if you can come up with some more. of the key words, what's the hardest to come up with a synonym for? Yeah, I and mine, right?
Very charged and
Yeah. It's hard, yeah, it's hard to come up with another way to say like a personal pronoun, right? So what does that suggest is central to the meaning of the sentence? Yeah, the focus on the individual, right? Okay, good. What else can you come up with here? Let's think about the connotations of some of these words that you have chosen, right? The ideas that they suggest, right? So if we look at a word like entitled, do we usually use entitled in a positive or a negative sense? Yeah, if we call someone entitled, what are we usually saying about them? Yeah, someone who's acting entitled is acting like a spoiled little kid who didn't get a toy they think they deserve, right? So it's a word that often has a negative connotation. Although it also has a specific legal meaning, right? You know, what you're entitled to is what you're entitled, you know, what you have earned by law, right? Or what you have been granted by law. So, how well does the idea of rights or the idea of deserving express what's meant here by entitled, do you think?
Wait, what was the question?
How well do these synonyms express what this sentence seems to mean by entitled?
Pretty well.
Okay, pretty close, right? But usually kind of missing the legal dimension, right? And particularly in terms of deserve, right? And without the other negative associations we have with the word entitled, right? What about opinion here? I noticed one of the first things that you came up with was how one feels. Why did you associate feeling with opinion before you associated thoughts with opinion?
Because an opinion, doesn't have to be true. Like, it's not like a fact, it's not like set in stone.
Yeah.
that's how you feel about something like an action or like an
Yeah, an opinion, it might be your personal thoughts, your personal feelings, right? But yeah, an opinion is not in and of itself objectively true, right? Belief doesn't make a thing true. If 75% of Americans believe Barack Obama to be a cactus, that does not make him a cactus, right? So opinion is not necessarily connected to reality, it's connected to your own feelings, right? So what is this statement saying about individual ideas?
People have a right to their ideas.
Okay, or at least that this person is saying they have a right to their ideas, whatever they are, right? However disconnected from reality they might actually be. And what are they suggesting then about their willingness to change their minds?
They're not going to.
Yeah. If you're insisting on your right to your opinion,
That means you're not going to change it.
yeah,
Because in any book, stupid.
yeah, you're telling the other person. Now, I would argue that when you are presented with facts and you continue to cling to an opinion that is disproved by facts, right? That tends to make you look stupider than sticking to your guns, right? But yeah, the basic idea here, right, is defensive, right? I'm entitled to my opinion and you can't change my mind. So let's look at the second example here. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So try to pick that apart. All right, locate the keywords and try to replace them with synonyms.
That sounds stupid, but what is self-evident?
Okay, so when something is self-evident, right, it means that it doesn't require proof. Right? It's sufficient in itself to provide evidence of its truth.
Kind of like the sky is blue.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all you got to do is look up and see, right? Although some 18th century philosophers would say that you can never be sure that the blue you or what you see as blue is what other people see as blue. But we can talk about that another time.
You could do facts or truths.
Okay, facts.
Same thing, so I mean, truth is like truth, and facts are truth.
Yeah.
Would
So-
we be an important word in this?
Yeah, absolutely.
But, I mean, it doesn't make sense, but I put the word us.
Us, okay. Right, we're still thinking in terms of a collective or a group identity, right? So whoever holds these truths to be self-evident, it's more than one person, right? What does hold mean in this context?
Like,
Think.
Think, okay.
like carry in mind or something.
Well, we often use the word hold to refer to something we're carrying, right?
What about conclude?
We conclude that these truths or these facts are self-evident.
Could self-evident, would it be like, could it be like a word obvious?
Yeah.
Could you do common sense?
Sure. Yep. Right. That which doesn't need to be proven or explained.
Could you do acknowledge or hold?
Okay, we acknowledge. Yeah. What about truths? Can you guys come up with anything else for truths?
Statements?
Okay, these statements. Okay, but what's the problem with using you all to indicate the collective here?
It's not including
You're
you.
not-
It doesn't include I, right? So yeah, it's got to be a group identity here that includes the self, right? First person plural pronoun, we. So let's work with what we've got here. Which of these meanings, which of these words do you think gets closest to the meaning of hold in this context?
Acknowledge,
Okay, why would you say acknowledge?
it's like, I really don't know. It just sounds.
You just have, yeah, it's a big
I don't know how
word.
to explain it, but like, I really feel like it would be acknowledged.
Okay, it sounds serious, right?
Right.
Yeah, acknowledge.
Okay. We acknowledge these truths to be self-evident. But I think that sense of hold meaning carry that you were talking about is actually relevant here. It doesn't quite mean here to carry in this case, but it sounds more personal, right, than acknowledge, right? Where, when you acknowledge something to be true, it can be almost grudging, right? It's like, okay, I concede your point.
Yeah.
I acknowledge that you're correct.
Right.
Whereas to hold seems to me more to believe something personally and deeply, right?
So we could put like believe as a synonym for hold, or?
Yeah, and then that also kind of runs into tension with the whole idea of truths, right?
Right.
Because truths aren't a matter of belief, right? When we think about truths, we're thinking about things that are objectively true whether you believe them or not. So there's a kind of like, there's a weird tension in the sentence as it's written, right? We believe that these truths don't require evidence. But you're making the self-evidence of these truths a matter of belief, right?
Right.
Right? It is our opinion, it is our belief that these truths are self-evident.
So whatever way you look at it, it could either contradict itself or like it could like.
Yeah, there is something weirdly self-contradictory in the statement, right? That we believe these things speak for themselves, but someone outside of our group may disagree, right?
I don't like the quote, common sense isn't so common.
What's that? Common sense isn't so common, yeah. Which on the one hand is something you could use to make fun of someone you think doesn't have any common sense, right? But also acknowledges that common sense is not actually the universal thing that we think it is, and is context dependent, right? So what we have here, like what we're doing with both of these sentences here, right, is we're pulling out assumptions underlying them, right? We're pulling out things that the writers of these sentences assume to be true and don't feel they need to have to explain, right? So the assumption in this statement is that the individual has a right to defend their beliefs against being changed, right? The assumption in this statement is that our group of framers of this document believe these things to be so obvious they don't require explanation. But that may not include you, right? And in fact, certainly doesn't include the people they're writing against. Right? Does anybody know where this statement comes from? What it's the first sentence of?
You said it was written by John.
It's written by Thomas Jefferson.
The Declaration.
Yeah, this is the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence, right? So when we know the context here, right, by implication, right, we hold these truths to be self-evident. The colonists writing the Declaration, the Continental Congress, but by implication, you, the King, and the Parliament of Great Britain, obviously don't hold these truths to be self-evident, right? We can see assumptions being made in Bilbo's and Gandalf's exchange as well, right? That Bilbo is assuming that the meaning of his good morning is clear and transparent. And Gandalf is operating under the assumption that all language is inherently ambiguous, right? So, to give you an example of why Gandalf is generally right in this case. One of my wife's cousins, when she was 14, did a jump rope-a-thon for charity. She was trying to raise money to build wells in rural villages in Africa. So, perfectly laudable, admirable goal, right? Nice kid, meant well. But she passed around these flyers when she was trying to raise money that said, "Jumps for joy, leaving a footprint on a child's heart." Yeah, we can see the problem here, right?
Yeah.
Now, what does she mean to say?
It means I leave an impact on, their lives.
Yeah, exactly. So, and she's relating it to the activity of jumping rope, right? Your foot coming down, and that that making that impact, leaving that impression, right? The problem is, what does this sound like if you don't know the context?
You're stomping a
It
child.
sounds like you're stomping on a child's heart, right? Yeah.
Maybe it should have been like leaving a footprint on a child's life instead of like heart.
Yeah, it might have also been wise to leave the footprint out of it altogether, right?
Leaving an impact.
Yeah. But yeah, the point here being, right, is that we often don't understand the ways in which our language is slippery and ambiguous, right? So, for example, there are actually a couple of really good ones here that the textbook gives us on page 40, right? I'm going to choose two that I particularly like here, right? Local high school dropouts cut in half. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the threat of a terrible punishment, right?
Vaccines may contain rabies.
So not seeming to understand the nature of what a vaccine is, right? A vaccine is a mild strain of a virus that is injected into you to produce antibodies, right? So, it's enough that you'll produce the antibodies, but not enough that you'll get seriously ill, right?
So were they trying to say like new vaccines will
Contain, actually.
keep away rabies, kind of like get a hold on it?
Yeah. So I think that there's
rabies in the vaccine that you're injecting.
It's playing on the double meaning of contain there, or at least the writer of the headline didn't think about the double meaning of contain, right?
Okay.
So they're talking about containing an outbreak of rabies, right? But they are also literally referencing the fact that, you should hope that the rabies vaccine contains rabies, right? If the rabies vaccine contains, rubella, right, that doesn't do you any good if you're trying to contain a rabies outbreak. My favorite here, though, is include your children when baking cookies.
Like put them in the bag?
Yeah, and they mean,
Cook with them.
when you're cooking, let your kids help, right?
Right.
But yeah, it sounds like
You're
Yeah.
cooking your children.
chopping up your kids and putting them in the cookies, right?
Right. It's like like his umbrella.
Yeah. So one thing that we need to make sure that we're always paying attention to is these kinds of potential multiple meanings and multiple associations that we have with words. A good example, again, is that, Gia, you associated carrying with the word hold, even though it doesn't really mean to physically carry in this context, right? That association here is still valid in terms of the sentence, right? So when you are reading any sentence or any phrase, think about the multiple meanings that these words might carry. Now, context will determine for you which one is correct. But that doesn't mean that those other associations disappear, or that they're not valid in context. Okay, so does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, so there's one more thing that I do want to try to go over today. And this is related to these theories of language that we started with at the beginning of class. It really kind of, as everything we've been doing has been related to these theories of language. So there's a branch of linguistic philosophy called speech act theory. And speech act theorist argues that anything that we write or say has really is associated with three different types of action. The first is locutionary, right? And that's simply what is said. The second is illocutionary, which refers to what is intended. And the last is perlocutionary, which refers to what is done, or the effect. So if we are sitting at a table having a meal, and I ask, is there any salt? What's the locutionary act? What have I done?
Ask the question and result.
Yeah, I just asked a question. I've asked whether or not there's any salt, right? What is the illocutionary force of that action? What do I mean if I ask if there's any salt?
You need salt.
Yeah, I'm asking you to give me some salt, right? So because you understood correctly what my intention was, the perlocution,
Is you getting salt?
you pass me the salt, right? Now, some speech acts have a force really all speech acts have a force outside of themselves, outside of mere language, right? They all enact things in the real world. Some change the state of the world more than others, right? So, for example, in a marriage ceremony, when the preacher or the justice of the peace says, by the power vested in me by the state of Georgia, I now pronounce you spouses, right? Through that speech act, your status, right, your legal status and your relationship to another person has been changed. The same thing happens when an elected official takes an oath of office, right? They recite the oath of office, and when they're done, their legal status has changed, right? They're now duly sworn in as president or senator or dog catcher or whatever, right? So the point that I'm trying to make here is that you want to think about the illocutionary force, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about this next time, of any given action, right? So, or any given speech act, right? So, what is the intent of this piece of language, and what impact does it have on the world, right? What are the effects of it? This is exactly the question that Gandalf and Bilbo are trying to resolve, right? Gandalf was asking Bilbo, right, what is the illocutionary force of your good morning, right? What is the intention behind your good morning? Okay, so we're about out of time. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Okay, great. So remember, the assignment is due tonight, right? So I need the vocabulary words and assignment 1 on page 36. Everybody knows which one it is, right? So let's just do the method on the reading. Okay, and you're using the Seneca essay. Okay, so let me just go quickly grab the rags and disinfect. Oh, I've got disinfectant here because for whatever reason I forgot to bring them with me, and I'll be right there.